Hello, historians. We are mixing up our notes just a little bit today. So instead of me giving this lecture in front of the class, I'm going to record this lecture so you can take your notes at your own pace. You can pause the video at any time you need to write something down, just so we can all get this out of the way. And I think this will be a little bit easier. So today we're talking about Greece social structure. And so this is the social structure at the top of your guided notes. I'm going to go through it so you can listen to it while you're writing it down, and then at the end you can pause. So the caption of this picture is that ancient Greece had a strict social hierarchy. Only freemen could be citizens and take part in government. Politicians were at the top, followed by soldiers and other male citizens, then male children. Women and female children had far fewer rights, as did foreigners. They were not citizens. Enslaved people had harsh lives and no rights. So we see this social hierarchy. Up at the very top are male citizens in government. These are politicians. These are people who have worked towards being in the government, and that's their job. So the very, very top, it's not the gods, it's not the king, it's male citizens in government. But at the same time, that would be at the same rank as king, because remember, we had things like democracy in ancient Greece. So all of these government types are pretty much the same in according to the social hierarchy. Then, under male citizens in government, we have soldiers and other male citizens. Under that, we have male children. So remember, these aren't citizens yet, but these male children have the potential to become citizens once they're adults, because remember, children aren't citizens. Then, under that, we have women, female children, and foreigners. These people are people who never have the ability to become citizens. So, our first three ranks are all citizens, and then under that are people who have never have the ability to become citizens: women, female children, and foreigners. And finally, we have enslaved people at the very bottom. So, you can pause for a second, copy this all down, and then continue on. Our first type of, sorry, I am figuring this out just as y'all are. Okay, so let me drag my camera down. So our first, sorry, I don't know if my camera is grayed out on y'all's screen, but we are going to continue on. So, very, very top of our social hierarchy is male citizens in government. So, the top of the social hierarchy or structure were the quote unquote best people, which is what they called themselves, or the aristoi. They had more money than everyone else, so this class could provide themselves with armor, weapons, and a horse when on a military campaign. It was these rich people who controlled the military and government. The aristocrats, which just is another word for rich people, were often split into powerful family factions or clans who controlled all of the important political positions in the polis or city state. Their wealth came from having property, and even more importantly, the best land in the city states, which meant it was the most fertile and the closest to the protection offered by the city walls. Because remember, every single city state had walls around it to protect itself. So your first three blanks are aristoi, military and government, and property. Your next category is soldiers and other male citizens. Oops. So, soldiers were the next group down on the social hierarchy. These people fought and gave their lives to protect their city state, so they were honored heavily, especially in Sparta. The other male citizens were in two categories: the middle class and the lower class. The middle class male citizens usually had jobs in manufacturing, trade, and commerce. They had an okay amount of money, but they weren't rich. The lower class were called the periakoi. These were the men who had land, but the land wasn't as good and it was farther away from the city. Their property was less well protected than the prime land near the city proper. The land might be so far away that the owners had to live on it rather than travel back and forth from the city. So your blanks here are number 4, fought. Number 5, manufacturing, trade, and commerce. And number 6, periakoi. The next group is male children. When a baby is born in ancient Greece, it was a cause for celebration. The Greeks loved to dance, so of course they had a dance the father did holding his new baby. The mother made a wreath for the door so that everyone knew they had a new baby. Friends and family bought many gifts. Once they hit 7 years old, male children of citizens attended schools where the curriculum covered reading, writing, and mathematics, just like your curriculum covers here at Oberlin. After these basics were mastered, studies turned to literature, for example, Homer, who was a popular author, poetry, and music, especially the lyre. And the lyre is this picture right over here on the right. Athletics were also an essential element in a young person's education. So your next blanks are 7, 8, reading, 9, writing, and 10, mathematics. Women. Women had few rights in comparison to male citizens. They were unable to vote, own land, or 13, inherit land, except in Sparta. And to inherit land means, for example, if my parents die, the land that they owned would be passed down on to me. But women weren't able to inherit land except in Sparta. A woman's place was in the home, and her purpose in life was the raising of children. She didn't go to work, she wasn't a scholar, she didn't fight in the military, she just stayed at home. Contact with non-family males was discouraged, and women occupied their time with indoor activities such as woolwork and weaving. Women even had to ask their husbands for permission to leave the house. They weren't able to leave the house on their own. But in her own home, a woman was the boss. She did not have to ask her husband about anything that happened in her home. She cooked and cleaned and sewed and raised the kids. Some women had enslaved women to do all or some of the work for them. Some women helped their husband in the fields. But all women, with or without the help of slaves, ruled their house. With control over activities inside the house and inside the courtyard, that alone gave women a great deal of power in ancient Greece. But it was still restrictive. Just having to ask for permission to visit a neighbor was frustrating to some ancient Greek women, but that was the way of life all over ancient Greece. So I want you to really put yourself in the perspective of these ancient Greek women. Imagine that you were an adult. You were not a child anymore. You were supposed to have all the rights of an adult, but you couldn't leave the house unless you asked your husband for permission, just like he was one of your parents. That was very unfair. So your blanks here are 11, vote, 12, own land, 13, inherit, which means, remember, pass down. 14 is ask their husbands. Let me go back. And 15 is ruled their house. So then we get to female children and foreigners. Remember, they are part of that group that will never become citizens. Girls were allowed to go to school in a similar manner to boys, but with greater emphasis on dancing, gymnastics, and musical accomplishment that could be shown off in musical competitions and at religious festivals and ceremonies. So they didn't really learn things like literature, math, and reading. The ultimate goal of a girl's education wasn't to have her have a job or to go to school, but it was to prepare her for her role in raising a family. So the only reason that a girl went to school was to help her become a mom. Aside from slaves, most Greek city-states would have had a number of free foreigners, called xenoi, who had chosen to relocate from other areas of Greece, the Mediterranean, and the Near East, bringing with them skills such as pottery and metalworking. These foreigners usually had to register their residence, so became a recognized class, which were lower in status than full citizens, called the metics or the mediakoi. In return for the benefit of quote-unquote guest citizenship, they had to provide a local sponsor, pay local taxes, sometimes pay additional taxes, contribute to the cost of minor festivals, and even participate in military campaigns when necessary. So remember, one of the biggest responsibilities of Greek citizens was to be able to vote, especially if you were in a city-state with democracy. So imagine if you were a medic. So you were a person who was a foreigner who had moved to a city state in Greece. Let's say you moved to Athens from a different city state. You would be considered a medic or a mediakoi. So you wouldn't have the same rights as full citizens. You wouldn't be able to vote, but you still had to pay taxes, sometimes pay additional taxes just because you're an immigrant. And remember, an immigrant is someone who moves to a country, or in this case, a city state. They had to pay for the cost of minor festivals, and they even had to participate in the military, but they didn't have the representation to be able to vote. So this was unfair because they didn't have representation. And then finally, we get to enslaved people. So in Greek society, enslaved people, or douloi, were seen as a necessary and perfectly normal part of city life. Like in most civilizations, slavery was not based on race. Instead, people of any race could become slaves, even other Greeks. And so Greeks are Europeans, the Greeks were white people, and they enslaved other white people. So, acquired through war and conquest, or kidnap and purchase, they believed that enslaved people were simply amongst life's losers. There were even intellectual arguments from philosophers like Aristotle, which propounded the beliefs that enslaved people were demonstrably lesser than the Greeks, which were a product of their environment and inherited characteristics. Greeks persuaded themselves that it was they who had the best environment and characteristics and the purest bloodline, and they were therefore born to rule. Simply put, they just believed that they were better than the enslaved people, which was untrue. The enslaved people were just as equal as they were. They just chose to enslave them. So, here are my sources. You have just a bit more time to go back through the video, take down any notes that you need, and then you will go to your next assignment on Canvas where you will use these notes and the links to fill out a chart and answer some questions. If you have any questions for me, you can raise your hand and I will answer them, but you can go ahead and get started on your next assignment.